I got that from Alice in Wonderland.
Of course.
It is an entry to a world of wonders that you stumble upon when looking for something else. That was my second book. I think maybe my first or second year of college, although I was always interested in the human mind. But when I learned that there was a field called cognitive psychology, later called cognitive science, and found out that they actually pay people for doing it, for figuring out how the mind works. I knew that's what I wanted to do with my life. When most people think of psychology, they think of psychotherapy, the guy with the couch and then the notebook and trying to cure people's neuroses. But most psychology is a research field. Experimental psychology tries to figure out what makes people tick by doing laboratory studies. Cognitive psychology focuses on intelligence, on memory, thinking, language, reasoning, imagery. And cognitive science is just the interdisciplinary study of how we think, including other fields like linguistics, philosophy, neuroscience, anthropology. There is a lot of difference of opinion. The main issue. Well, I think you have to first have some understanding of what the mind is for, what it evolved to do. Because unlike other intelligent devices like computers, which were put together by engineers for specific purposes, the brain evolved. And I think the first question one has to ask is, why are we smart? Why do we have brains? I don't think there's a single answer, because there are a lot of things that an intelligent organism has to do to stay alive. Understand the physical world, process visual input to know what are the objects out there and how they're arranged, but also getting beneath the surfaces of objects to figure out their causal relations. What can I throw? What can I bend? What can I use as a poison? What can I use as a projectile? Then we also live in a social world. The brain also evolved to make alliances, to learn from other people, to exchange favors, to find mates, to bring up children. And in the human case, that involves language, the most efficient way of exchanging ideas and negotiating social relationships. Well, I'm more impressed by what we all have in common as a species than in what makes people different. I think we do have an inkling as to what makes people different. One factor is surely genetics. That is, we aren't clones other than identical twins, and we each start out life with a slightly different complement of genes, which biases the brain in different ways. And we know this from studies of people who do or don't share genes or an environment. Identical twins reared apart, for example, who share their genes but not their environment, and who turn out to be strikingly similar, tell us that genes matter. So do adopted siblings brought up in the same household who don't share their variable genes but do share an environment, and they grow up not particularly alike, other than what they share from the culture. So one thing that makes us different is our genes. Another thing is the different cultures that we may have grown up in. We're similar not just because we're human beings, but because we both grew up in North America and were surrounded by American middle-class values. There's also sheer chance. Even if we were identical twins, we would not end up indistinguishable. And anyone who knows identical twins knows that this is true. They're very similar in their talents and in their temperaments, but you don't confuse them if you know them. And they'll often go their separate ways. Sometimes one will even be gay and another one will be straight, even though they share both their genes and their environment. So what that tells us is that sheer chance makes a difference, that some factor that we have no idea of how to measure, maybe how your neurons grew as your brain congealed in utero, maybe chance events that took place that to one twin but not another twin. There's a huge role of chance that we don't really understand, and it's kind of another factor that makes us what we are, makes us different, but people don't really understand how it works. Yeah, I think it is, because it's not nature versus nurture. If we didn't have a nature that allowed us to see the world in certain ways and learn in certain ways, then nurture would have no effect. I mean, you put a child in a family and you put a cat in a family, the child ends up talking, the cat doesn't. Now, the child had to learn to talk. No child is born speaking English, but the exposure to English only resulted in an ability to speak because the child's brain is wired in certain ways that the cat's brain isn't. So it's never nature versus nurture. It's nature makes the effects of nurture possible. Share the excitement of the science of language. I felt that the time was ready to tell a unified story about how language works, namely that I argue that it's a human adaptation, a part of the human species' birthright. And enough was known about language, in particular about exactly the kind of questions that curious people have, like who decides what's proper grammar? Why are there so many languages? How do kids learn to talk? Where do new words come from? That I felt that I could share this accumulated research from my field and hoped that people would be interested. No, not at all. I was surprised, yeah. My friend said, you write a book, a popular book, it's on the shelves of the bookstore for 6 weeks, and then it vanishes into oblivion. And I wrote it prepared for that to happen. I think I did tap something that others hadn't, namely the genre of popular science writing, which had been pioneered by writers like Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins and Lewis Thomas and others, had never been applied to the sciences of mind. And people are interested in the mind at least as much as they're interested in dinosaurs and genes and galaxies and so on. So I think I was... by applying the art of popular science writing to the human mind, I think I found a niche. I tried to do for the rest of the mind what I had tried to do previously for language, namely share the science in an accessible way, but also if you're just all over the place and you don't have a coherent framework or narrative, I don't think it's possible to succeed in writing a book that people will be interested in. There has to be some overall framework into which you fit the hundreds or thousands of studies. And as with the language instinct, for how the mind works was based on a couple of ideas. One of them was the one that we mentioned at the outset, namely evolution. You can't understand any complex system without knowing what it was designed to do. The equivalent in the case of a natural system, like the brain, is what did evolution select it for. But also the idea of thinking as information processing or computation, that that intelligence doesn't come from some magic power or special juice, or even from the fact that we have brains, because other species have brains, but they don't do what we do. And that the difference comes, I think, from the way the neural tissue is organized to process information. And so some of the concepts that we use to make sense of man-made intelligent systems, codes, representations, signals, transformations, the whole lingo of communication and information theory can be applied to the human mind to shed light on things like memory, language, and vision. And that was the other idea that I put into how the mind works. That actually was on my own research. The other books were an overview of my field. This one concentrated on my own research, and believe it or not, it was an attempt to write a popular book on irregular and regular verbs. Now, it doesn't sound like a recipe for a bestseller. And I say it falls in the great academic tradition of knowing more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. But I had the idea to write the book because I thought that this was actually could serve as a different entry point, a different rabbit hole, if you want, into the workings of language. The idea was that irregular verbs are things like come, came, break, broke, stink, stank, which are unpredictable and have to be memorized. You only become aware of them when you learn some other language, and the first thing you have to do is you memorize all the irregular conjugations. Whereas a regular verb is something like walk, walked, play, played, where the past tense is predictable. Just add the ed suffix. And though it sounds kind of dry, these, I argued, are examples of the two processes that make language possible, namely memory, which is what we have to do when we learn words. A literate adult knows maybe 100,000 words, each of which had to have been memorized. But of course, we don't just blurt out words or cliches or formulas, but we assemble them in real time into sentences using rules. Computational algorithms. And so these two ingredients of language, memory for words, computation for phrases and sentences, I argued are on display in microcosm in the irregular verbs which we memorize and the regular verbs which we compose. I wouldn't say the hate mail, but certainly the biggest academic controversies. Yeah, it gets ugly. That was on the concept of human nature. And I was pushed to write that in part because of some of the reactions that I got to how the mind works, where there were objections, both from the left and from the right, that were as political and moral as they were scientific. That the idea of an inborn human nature rooted in the biology of the brain, in turn rooted in genetics and evolution, is an idea that strikes people as uncomfortable, even dangerous. And so I wanted to, so much of the criticism from how the mind works was on these foundational, almost philosophical issues that I thought they had to be addressed. And for the political left, there are fears of innate biological differences. If men and women aren't identical biologically, will that set the cause of women's progress back? Racial differences, individual differences, do some people succeed more than others in society, not because of prejudice, but because they're smarter or harder working than others? That seems like a challenge to egalitarian ideals. Perfectibility, can we design a utopian society when we raise children without selfishness and violence, or will selfishness and violence always be part of human nature and therefore have to be dealt with by some kind of punitive method? Those are concerns from the left. From the right, there are concerns if we're really products of evolution. Does that just mean that we selfishly try to propagate our genes and are deaf to higher moral callings? Does it mean that the foundations of religion, such as scriptures, have to be thrown out, including all the moral stuff, like the Ten Commandments, if the story of how we came to be turns out to be incorrect? Will there be infinite Twinkie defenses, excuses for bad behavior? My genes made me do it, my evolutionary history made me do it, so we can never hold people morally responsible. So there's this whole can of worms that's opened when you study human mind from a biological framework, and the blank slate was about those worms. In the political and moral sphere, there's the politically correct left that doesn't want to admit the possibility of any human differences. There's also I guess I can call it the politically correct right, because it's a different kind of political correctness, but the pro-religion, family values, traditional mores, sometimes seen to be in opposition to an evolutionary or biological framework. Within academia, there are people who want to attribute more to the environment than I do. People who work in neural network modeling, who try to devise models that soak up correlations of information in the environment and try to get away with less pre-programming. There are people who believe that the mind has less structure than I would be willing to attribute. That is, that it's less organized into subsystems or modules or mental organs, and rather that we have one all-purpose learning device that we use for everything. So that's some of the opposition. This tried to combine my interest in language with my interest in human nature. What can we learn about human nature through language? And not through language as in the language instinct of how language itself works. What are the gears and belts and pulleys that allow us to put words together? But this one looks at meaning. What do words mean? What do sentences mean? How do we use words in social interaction? What can we learn about, say, the human concept of space and time from words like prepositions and past, present, future tense, which are about space and time? What can we learn about causality, the human concept of causality, from the way we use verbs? And even in later chapters, I switched from cognition to emotion and social relationships. What can we learn about human emotion from swearing? And why are some words swear words, and why do we swear in such bizarre ways? And innuendo. Why don't we say what we mean? Why do we constantly veil our intentions in euphemism and doublespeak and innuendo and taboo? Why do I say would you like to come up and see my etchings instead of do you want to have sex? Why do I say, if you could pass the salt, that would be awesome, instead of give me the salt? And I use that euphemism and innuendo as a way of probing our social interactions. A number of phenomena go on in the crafting of language to political purposes. One of them is innuendo and euphemism. That is, if anything you say as a politician has some danger of alienating some constituency, how do you say something that will alienate the fewest as possible? And you're forced often to vaguer and vaguer, windier and loftier and emptier speech. The most you could hope for is what's sometimes called dog whistle rhetoric, namely messages that are pitched at such a high level that only certain constituencies can hear them. They know you're talking to them, but other people don't know what you're talking about, and so you can get them into your camp without alienating the people who don't know that you're using code words for one thing or another. So you have empty things like change. Who could be against change? But of course, what the change is very much depends on your orientation in the first place. When you have a politician who deviates from that formula, being vague and empty, you have what we know as the gaffe. And Michael Kinsley had the classic definition of a political gaffe. A gaffe in Washington is when a politician says something that's true. And it is the reason we're all hypocrites in the sense that we complain about politicians' empty rhetoric, but on the other hand, as soon as they speak honestly, then that's what the journalists pounce on. Joe Biden being the famous example. And because a lot of political journalism consists of waiting for the gaffe, that puts a pressure on politicians to avoid gaffes by avoiding saying anything. I think what a lot of political coverage ends up doing. I suspect it's always been there. It may have gotten, you have a sense that it's gotten worse in the last 10, 15 years, but I suspect it's always been there. Well, I certainly listen for certain habits of mind and decision making. I don't believe that anyone has an ideology that's going to steer them through every possible crisis and contingency. But I'm interested in the politician who can evaluate different opinions, that takes steps not to impose a groupthink where one opinion just becomes the only thing that's considered in a group of like-minded people. Someone who will assess incoming evidence and perhaps change course as the facts shift. Someone who will seek out expertise. Someone who will basically apply intelligence to the very challenging problems that any president inevitably will face. Well, it is partly so that we can assess how a politician thinks and what a politician believes. But of course, the art of rhetoric is one of the main tools by which a politician in a democracy can assemble coalitions that can work together. Stirring rhetoric, if it's not deceptive or divisive, can bring people along enough to get something done. And of course, successful presidents have often been successful communicators. Roosevelt, Kennedy, Reagan, and so on. Above their intelligence, they had the gift of getting people to cooperate. I think that was the one in response to Clinton's testimony after the Paula Jones deposition, where he infamously said, when asked whether he was having a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky, said, well, it depends on what the meaning of is. That is when he was challenged after his lawyer had said there is no sex of any kind. And he said it depends on what the meaning of is. Something that I return to in the Stuff of Thought, where I look at the semantics of tense. What is the present tense? What is the past tense? And use that to analyze Clinton's self-defense. I gave him a good grade. I think he was an astute, intuitive linguist. And what he said, namely, when asked the question, his affair was over. And when he was asked, is there any sex? And he said, no, in the present tense. The occasion for that closing sentence, though, was the fact that Of course, what the prosecutor was interested in was not whether he was currently involved in an affair, but whether he ever had had one in recent history. Clinton was aware of that as well, and he said, "My goal in the deposition was to be truthful but not helpful." Now, the question is, in a court of law, is that a defensible strategy? Well, I'll leave it to the lawyers to decide that. But what he was exploiting was the fact that in ordinary conversation we do both. You can't have an ordinary conversation unless you're both truthful and helpful. If you're not helpful, you're either lying or you're going on at such length that your listener is going to get up and leave. Well, we would talk, if you have to spell everything out, your speech would sound like a legal contract. Because if I were to say, how much longer will this take? Well, what does this mean? In context, you're thinking, well, it's probably our give and take until the calls come in. And that's because you and I both have the same model as to what's happening. I don't have to spell out what this means. And when I say how much longer, you're not going to say 7 minutes, 42.1 seconds, because you know I don't need it to that degree of precision. We're not even aware of all of the missing steps that we unconsciously fill in and all of the intelligent guesses we make about the other person's expectations. It often is, exactly. And in a court of law, when instead of having conversational partners who cooperate to move the conversation along, you have adversaries, then each side can exploit what is left unsaid, and then in order to withhold the damaging truth from the other side, and then you get a departure from the ordinary rules of conversation in the courtroom. And that's why Clinton, though I think technically correct, drew such fury. And in fact, his statement about it depends on what the meaning of is was cited as one of the 5 articles of impeachment when he was impeached. Okay. Well, you can certainly automatize things. That is, when you learn how to drive, first you think through every motion of the stick shift, then it becomes automatic. And that involves a change in connection strengths in certain parts of the brain that allow you to do things without thinking about it. It doesn't literally change your genetic makeup in the sense of the sequence of bases on the DNA molecule, but it does change what becomes second nature. In fact, we call it second nature because acts as if it's in your human nature, but it's something that you acquire. Well, I think people can change within a certain range, and for different people, the ranges are in different places. It probably gets harder and harder as you approach the limits of your range. But of course, that's why we have education. That's why we make New Year's resolutions. That's why we try to change social norms. And people do, of course, inhibit impulses. They set alarm clocks, they turn off the TV, they say no to a second helping of dessert, they read, they practice, they take lessons. There are lots of ways in which we can change our habits. Some of them involve parts of the brain like the basal ganglia, which are 2 sets of nuclei buried deeply within the brain that package routines of behavior so that you can just kind of turn them on instead of thinking through each step. For motor sequences like a golf swing or a baseball pitch, the cerebellum, that kind of little brain hanging at the back of your brain, executes smooth motions as a result of practice. The frontal lobes, the parts right behind your forehead, can inhibit impulses that spring from more evolutionarily ancient parts of the brain so that you can delay gratification. If the choice is between a yummy dessert now and 2 pounds heavier on the scale tomorrow, the frontal lobes help you say, forego the pleasure now, get the greater pleasure tomorrow morning on the scale. So those are some of the parts of the brain that are involved. Well, I'm not being a licensed clinician, I probably shouldn't give specific advice, but I would recommend working with a clinician. There are programs, some of them implemented on a computer, that try to train children to pay more attention to the subtle aspects of language that ordinarily can slip by, paying attention to the differences between consonants that sound alike, to the order of consonants in clusters of consonants. And even though it might be harder to begin with if you're in that part of the spectrum. Practice can certainly help you along. I can't remember a time at which I really believed in God, at least thinking other than just accepting Bible stories as they were narrated. So I don't remember any epiphany. It just was never really part of my worldview. And so it naturally morphed into an interest in the science of mind and brain. It was never a shock to me that thinking consists of brain cells firing in patterns, that our consciousness is a function of our brain activity. To some people, to some readers of How the Mind Works, this was the biggest shock of the book, something that I think most brain scientists and cognitive scientists don't even think about, because they just walk into the door with a naturalistic view of the mind and brain. Yes, and I probably wrote that in response to people who first pointed out that was an implication of this worldview. But yeah, and that's not a statement of faith or dogma, but it's a result of what we've learned about thought and feeling, namely that there isn't any aspect of it that can't be pinned down to brain function. If you mess with the chemistry of the brain by taking drugs, you can get changes in mood and personality and even perception in the case of hallucinogens. If a part of the brain becomes damaged, a part of the person can become lost. If you sever the connections between the two cerebral hemispheres as a surgical treatment, it's as if there are two consciousnesses in the same skull. So we just know from countless kinds of brain studies and brain manipulation that's where consciousness and thought and feeling reside. This is, I guess, I'm not really an expert in psychopathology, but I mean, in broad outline, there seem to be genetic causes of differences in brain activity, sometimes perhaps due to brain structure, because we know that almost all psychiatric disorders are partly heritable. There seems to be a disruption in some of the neurotransmitter systems. That is, the neurons or brain cells influence each other by releasing little dabs of chemicals that seep across a little gap. And there are complex systems in the brain that regulate the amounts of those different kinds of chemicals. Those seem to be out of whack in some cases of psychosis. It's not true invariably that a person with a psychotic break can never recover. They'll probably never be indistinguishable from a person who's never had such a break. But there are cases of recovery. Perhaps the mathematician John Nash, portrayed in the movie A Beautiful Mind, would be the most famous example. Not a typical example, but it does happen. Yes, this is Herrnstein and Murray 14 years ago wrote a book called The Bell Curve. I knew Richard Herrnstein. He was one of my graduate school teachers, and I know Charles Murray, who works here in Washington at the American Enterprise Institute. The book I think the subtitle was Class Structure and Intelligence in American Life, and it was about the underappreciated role of intelligence in many social outcomes. The fact that intelligence predicts outcomes like employment, income, social status, crime, child abuse, statistically. I mean, it's not destiny. And in one chapter, they then applied it to some of the black-white differences in America, arguing that the causes of the black-white difference in outcomes were not 100% environmental, but some mixture of environment and genetics. I assume that was what you had in mind when asking about the relevance of DNA to intelligence. My own reading is I was not persuaded by that particular chapter, and that's the chapter that people think was the point of the whole book. The rest of the book, I mean, putting aside the black-white difference, but just within races, the differences between one white person and another, difference between one black person and another, I think there is an influence of intelligence, and I think part of the influence of intelligence is an influence of the genes. So I think that they were closer to the scientific consensus in talking about intelligence in general when they applied it to race differences, and I think they would be the first to agree. The evidence is much more equivocal, and I have never endorsed that particular chapter, even though there's much else in the book that I did find persuasive. I certainly wouldn't define intelligence in a way that would restrict it to humans, as some kind of species chauvinism. If you want to understand what human intelligence is, you've got to have some independent idea of what it means to be intelligent. Roughly, I would say that intelligence is the ability to achieve goals in multiple ways. That is, if there's a system has to be goal-oriented for intelligence even to apply to it. And that's why I think just information of the kind that could be carried by electrons or quanta doesn't itself count as information unless you, as intelligence, unless you do something with it to get something. If you can get to that something by multiple routes, then that's, I think, corresponds with what we mean by intelligence. William James had a wonderful passage where he said, what's the difference between, say, Romeo approaching Juliet and iron filings approaching a magnet? Why do we say one of them is intelligent, the other one's not? And he said, well, imagine that a wall was put between Romeo and Juliet. Well, Romeo and Juliet wouldn't idiotically press their lips against opposite sides of the wall the way iron filings in a magnet would if there's a card between them. Romeo would find some other way of getting to Juliet by going around the wall or over the wall or knocking down the wall. That is, he'd use different courses of action, all united by the fact that they bring about the same goal. So by that standard, many other organisms are intelligent. I don't think humans are the only intelligent organism, although we're probably the most intelligent. But you can see that when dogs and cats and rats and so on can adapt their behavior flexibly to attain something that they want. I think there's a kind, in microorganisms, I think they're not intelligent because there are fixed mechanical rules, ways of getting a goal. But one could say that there's a kind of intelligence in their, in the way that evolution put them together, and that in the same way that the process of evolution can give rise to signs of design in physical structures, it could in behavioral repertoires as well. But okay, I can answer that. Yeah, I think there's nothing that, in principle, that would prevent a human-made system from being intelligent, and in fact, in many ways, our computers already are intelligent. Yeah, I think that was an ingenious research strategy. I mean, how do you study consciousness? In particular, his goal was the neural correlates of consciousness. What happens in the brain that corresponds to being aware of something? And he suggested, quite reasonably, that vision would be a good way of getting at it, because when we see something, that's a very concrete instance of being conscious of it. I see it, it's red, it's square, it's 4 feet away. And then there are tricks that a neuroscientist can use to find out what process in the brain corresponds to that. And an example being the phenomenon of what's called binocular rivalry. If you have one thing shown to one eye and another thing shown to the other eye, an example is if you take a tube of paper, roll up paper into a tube, and then look at your hand through the tube through one eye while keeping the other eye open. Then what will happen is you'll see your hand through the tube, and then it will disappear, and it'll look as if there's a hole in your hand. Then the hole will fill in, then it will disappear, and fill in again, and so on. That's because your brain is having trouble merging the two very different images coming from the two eyes into a single percept. Well, this has been known in psychology for 100 years. But Crick and many others noted, well, that's a great way to study consciousness, because the information coming in from the two eyeballs is the same. The experience of the whole person fluctuates. A few seconds hand, a few seconds whole, a few seconds hand, a few seconds whole. If you can find what part in the brain changes when the guy says, oh, now it's a whole, and then changes back when he says, now it's a hand, you're getting at the part of the brain that must register the contents of consciousness as opposed to just the raw data coming in from the eyeballs. Even better, you can do it with monkeys, because monkeys can be trained to flip a lever every time what they're seeing changes. And you can actually implant electrodes in the monkey's brain, something you can't do with humans, to find out what's changing in the monkey's brain when the monkey's experience changes. So I think it's a terrific research program, and it's shed a lot of light on what goes on in the brain that makes us conscious. Oh, it's nowadays one of the glories of the American research system is that it's distributed over many, many universities. It probably never was the government, but it used to be often private labs that were. It used to be in the 19th century. It would be kind of English country gentlemen like Darwin puttering around in his greenhouse. Now, since the Second World War, the federal government has paid for basic research, and it's at hundreds of universities all over the world. And I assume it's okay am I allowed to bring up Sarah Palin? The most hair-raising, egregious, nauseating example of this occurred just last week when Sarah Palin ridiculed the idea that the federal government would sponsor research on fruit flies. And then she followed by saying, "I kid you not," as if this was the most absurd thing, ignoring the fact that almost everything we know about genetics originally came from research on fruit flies, such as the existence and behavior of chromosomes, which is one of the things that allows us to determine the cause of Down syndrome, something that she claims to be interested in devoting more resources toward. So genetics is something you study with fruit flies. Fruit flies are also a major economic pest. Huge citrus industry in California and Florida can be threatened by quirks of the behavior of the fruit fly. So in picking what she thought sounded like an example of government waste, she was identifying possibly the most one of the most important bodies of research in the entire scientific enterprise. And John McCain did the same thing. In 2 debates, he ridiculed research on the DNA of bears, of grizzly bears, not realizing that nowadays, if you're a biologist, you study DNA. Even if you're a field biologist looking at conservation of endangered species, and grizzly bears are a threatened species, there's a federal mandate to keep track of their numbers. How do you know whether you've seen 2 grizzly bears or whether you've seen 1 grizzly bear twice? Well, you snag bits of their hair and you do DNA analysis, and that's how we know how many grizzly bears are out there. In making the cheap shot of, well, I don't know if it's for a paternity test or a crime scene, both he and Palin, I think, showed a certain contempt for science that I and many other scientists find deeply disturbing. If you describe any scientific research out of context, you can make it sound silly. I think it's utterly irresponsible for a politician to do that, given how much of the fate of our country and our species is going to depend on basic and applied scientific research. No, he has not had any cheap shots about scientific funding. No. Again, I'm going to have to speak rather vaguely, kind of like politicians, because I'm not a clinician or an expert in disorders. Well, certainly we should understand them, all of these syndromes, and that does involve research. We should make finer distinctions. A lot of these are very broad, kind of garbage categories where any child who is learning in a slightly different way gets thrown into them, often because of the incentive structure of special education, that they get extra attention and extra resources if they're diagnosed as falling into a certain category. So we need better and more honest categories, and also an incentive structure in the schools that it isn't the case that you have to be diagnosed with a condition, given a label, in order to get this extra attention. I think perhaps genetics might help us in subdividing what seems to be a big ragbag of very different syndromes that all get called autism spectrum disorder or ADHD, that there are probably lots of subtypes that we might be able to differentiate with better genetics research. And better understanding, I think, just of the basic processes of how all of us learn to read, learn to add, remember information, make sense of scientific principles, so that we can pinpoint what is being done differently or what's going awry in the abnormal cases. I think all too often we give these off-the-shelf tests that just show that something is going wrong without really understanding what it is that's going wrong, partly because we don't understand what goes right when it does go right. So I like to start from a better understanding of how reading and math and scientific understanding work in the normal case. Well, even full biological siblings only share half of their genes. So when a man and woman have children, the reason they don't have a litter of clones, a litter of identical twins or triplets and so on, is because the genes get reshuffled. So even with the holding parents constant, the kids are going to inherit different combinations of genes, different subsets of genes. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of chance that goes into the wiring of the brain and the forming of the person. They're unique experiences that leave their stamp on a person in ways that we don't understand. There are sex differences. One's a boy, one's a girl. You can't tell with just one of each which of their traits are due to being male and female, but in large samples you can assess the probabilities, and there are some differences between boys and girls. Since each of them is an individual, it's hard for me, not knowing them and not being equipped to diagnose them, how to get them to communicate better. I don't know if I can offer much more than common sense. Let them interact, explain to each of them what might be different about the other, and hope that the natural course of events works out. I have studied language development in twins, although not these private languages, but I've done a little bit of reading on them. And in I think every case that's been studied isn't really a separate language with its own words and grammar and so on. It's really a distorted pronunciation of parts of the language that they hear from their parents or babysitters. What happens is when you learn a language, you have to perfect its pronunciation by listening to other people. If you're spending a lot of time with a twin who might have a certain mispronunciation, which you then copy, and then he copies it from you, and you copy it from him, and he copies your copy of his copy, it can sometimes veer off into an idiosyncratic pronunciation, which typically children outgrow by the time they were 2 or 3. So it's misleading to call it a different language, but it often sounds like one because the pronunciations are idiosyncratic. Generally, no, because accents are much more likely to conform to your peer group than your parents. And anyone who moves from, say, England to the US or vice versa, or from the deep south to California, finds that the kids don't end up speaking like them. They're indistinguishable from their classmates. So generally, we don't. We're so attuned when we're kids to how other kids talk that's what we glom onto. Yes, well, Lakoff's a very influential and distinguished linguist and cognitive scientist, and he's certainly been an influence on a lot of my thinking. In The Stuff of Thought, I have a chapter called The Metaphor, largely influenced by Lakoff's work on how much of everyday speech is metaphorical without people even realizing that they're using metaphors. If I say our language is saturated with metaphor, well, saturated, it's like language is a sponge and its constructions are a kind of liquid. If I say, well, I've sometimes fought with Lakoff, I attacked his book and he defended himself, I'm using the metaphor of argument, intellectual argument, being kind of warfare. It's almost hard to find any example of language that is not metaphorical, and that must tell us something about how the mind works. Lakoff has written a number of books exploring that idea and applying it to politics. I think he goes much too far, but while acknowledging that he has shed an awful lot of light on human cognition in this way. In terms of particular examples, well, Lakoff chose the example of freedom in a book that I didn't much care for, but nonetheless made the significant point that freedom has different meanings to different people in different parts of the spectrum. For the civil liberties-minded center-left and libertarians, it involves things like sexual orientation, choice in media, the ability to not have entertainment censored, to economic libertarians, it involves the ability to start a business and to run it unfettered by government regulations. To others, it just involves an opposition to tyranny and dictatorship, and it's a license for spreading democracy at the point of a gun to other countries such as Iraq. So one word and one concept can actually be quite divisive when you start to implement it. Taxes is another example. Professor Lakoff suggested that some of the stigma against taxes that conservative politicians have exploited can be lifted if you refer to taxes as membership fees, which I think has a certain tin ear to what kind of euphemism will actually work on people, and I think would immediately become a target of ridicule. So I don't think it's particularly astute political advice, although the more general point, I think, is valid, namely that the art of rhetoric and persuasion does consist often in framing the same concept in different ways. Hence, I mean, and there are many examples when the movement to outlaw abortion was called pro-life. The movement to keep abortion legal and available was called pro-choice, where choice is something that, who could be against choice if you're a Democrat in favor of freedom, small d Democrat, that is. And so, but on the other hand, who could be against life? So each side picks one aspect of the phenomenon that is very hard to be opposed to and uses that as the brand for their political movement. Probably just about anything that serves as a catchword or a tagline for a political campaign can have these opposite meanings, change being the most obvious example in this particular campaign. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't believe that there is any mind that's separate from the operation of the brain. So I think the studies that look at people who, say, have near-death experiences and have common accounts of what they experience as supposedly the soul leaves the body can all be explained in terms of the effects of oxygen deprivation on the brain, the kind of hallucinations that you have when the visual cortex is deprived of oxygen. And I don't think that any accounts of a person ceasing brain function and then being revived and then being able to remember conversations that took place when there was no brain activity. I don't think any of those have panned out. They all turn out to be false reports, cases where it would be very easy to reconstruct it after the fact. So I would have to disagree with the premise of the book. I haven't read it, but assuming that it's that mind can exist separately from brain, then I think the evidence is very strongly against that. On the other hand, the mind can affect the brain in the sense that the whole operation of the entire brain, which is very densely and richly interconnected, can affect certain parts of the brain. The mind can affect the body in the sense that when I want my hand to raise, it does raise, because mind in the sense of what my 100 billion neurons are doing can affect the body because the brain's connected to the spinal cord, which is connected to the hand. So I don't think that mind and brain or mind and body are separate in the sense of not being able to interact. But I don't think there's anything called mind that somehow floats free of the brain. Yes, it's a very pressing issue for linguistics because our subject matter is disappearing. There are estimated to be about 6,000 languages spoken on Earth today, and at least half of them are endangered in the sense of they probably won't last another few decades. How do we know that? Well, all the people who speak them are in their 70s or 80s, and this is certainly true of many Native American and First Nation Canadian languages. It could be that as many as 90% of them go extinct. That still leaves 600 languages. It's not as if everyone's going to end up speaking English or Chinese, but it still is a scientific tragedy and a cultural tragedy because each language is this exquisite, like a work of art, like a species, and each language also is the medium by which a culture is transmitted. It's often language is a repository of a lot of humor, imagery, metaphor. On the other hand, many languages have gone extinct because of coercive policies of governments such as Australia, Canada, and the US. Although, to be honest, a lot of them are doomed regardless of what government policy is, simply because nowadays we're becoming more interconnected. Opportunity lies in mastering the language of the majority country, and there's less incentive of keeping these languages alive. And I'm as guilty as anyone, like many grandchildren of immigrants. My grandparents arrived speaking Yiddish. My parents spoke it not as well as my grandparents, at least in the case of my mother. I don't speak it at all. Why? Well, I don't really need Yiddish to survive. I'm sorry that I didn't learn it, but the way I grew up gave me few opportunities to learn it, and that's an experience that is replicated worldwide. So I think what we can do is certainly do our best to document these languages before they vanish forever. They're useful not just to linguists, but even to archaeologists and anthropologists and historians tracing the history of migrations of peoples, for whom language is often the best set of evidence, kind of fossil evidence of where people have been and who they've interacted with. We know that the gypsies, for example, or the Roma, as they're now called, originated in India because their language, Romani, is closely tied to Indian languages. The other thing is, of course, to not get in the way of efforts by people to speak and preserve their own languages, to assist them in keeping it alive if there are the numbers and if there is the commitment to do so. Mental chunking. Yes, I'm very sympathetic to the suggestion from Douglas Hofstadter, and in fact I'm engaged in a research project right now with my graduate student, James Lee, on analogical reminding, a phenomenon that Hofstadter himself documented and that I've experienced a lot, and write about in my most recent book, The Stuff of Thought, that has an extensive discussion of the role of analogy in human thought. We talked about it a little bit in discussing unconscious metaphor. So the first person who said he attacked my argument must have been struck by what a verbal disagreement has in common with a physical assault. Namely, in both cases, there's a conflict of goals, there's an action by one party that in some way works to the disadvantage of another, it can be defended against, and so on. And so that must have shaped our language when the word attack and defend got transferred from the realm of warfare to the realm of argument. What is the mental process that allows that to happen? Well, that kind of leap must be something that happened to someone at a particular time and then eventually gets contagious and spreads through the language. So I've been trying to figure out how often these leaps occur to people. And I started just by studying myself, as many psychologists do. And I noticed that every once in a while, out of nowhere, one experience would remind me of another that have nothing in common in terms of their sensory experience. It's not like Marcel Proust writing about sipping the lime tea and being time transported back to his childhood when he sipped the lime tea. These are cases of reminding where the similarity is purely by analogy. So I'll give you an example. I go jogging, I have my iPod, lots of songs in the iPod, some of them are slow, some of them are fast. Of course, when you jog, you want something with the right tempo. So, and you can't both jog and select songs at the same time. So I let the iPod pick the song, and if it's the wrong tempo, I just skip over it. I go skip, skip, skip. Then there's one that I can jog to. Immediately I thought of how in baseball, the pitcher and catcher communicate by the catcher signaling pitches with finger signs, and then the pitcher shaking them off until he gets one that he likes. Now, that's, in one sense, it's a bizarre association. What does songs on an iPod have to do with throwing pitches? On the other hand, there is a very deep commonality between them, namely a case in which you can't directly pick something that you want, you wait for a selection, and you reject them until you get the one that you want. Somehow my brain categorized those two experiences in terms of that analogy that they share. And I do agree with Douglas Hofstadter that that is a very important mental process in allowing us to come to scientific discoveries, literary metaphors, figures of speech like argument is war that then enrich the language. And I'm trying to find out how often and how easily it happens and to which people. I like the, I do a lot of reading. I guess that counts as doing stuff with your mind. I like outdoor activity that involves getting from one place to another on people power. I like hiking. I like bicycling, mountain biking, tandem biking, road biking. I like kayaking. I like jogging. So anything where you do some exercise and scenery goes by. Montreal, Quebec. My grandparents came from Eastern Europe. They were Jewish immigrants. They came to Canada in the 1920s. Two of my grandparents came from Krasnostov, Poland, in the eastern part of Poland, which I actually went back to visit with my parents and my wife, Rebecca, 3 years ago. So I sort of went to the ancestral Pinker homeland. My mother's parents came respectively from Warsaw and from Moldova, Chisinau, Moldova. They came to Canada in the 1920s, I suspect because the immigration laws changed in 1924 in the United States. And Canada was kind of the closest you could get to New York when they wouldn't let Jews into New York anymore. I went to elementary and high school in the English-speaking segment of Montreal. Montreal was pretty linguistically segregated when I grew up, which is why, to my shame, I'm not bilingual in English and French. Then I left for graduate school in 1976 after having gotten my bachelor's degree from McGill University in Montreal. So at the age of 22, I moved to the Boston area, and I've pretty much lived there ever since, except for a couple of years in California. I became an American citizen about 14 years ago. I couldn't stand not being able to vote. My sister Susan is 3 years younger than me, and she is also an author. She's a Canadian journalist who has a column in the Globe and Mail, one of Canada's national newspapers, and recently wrote a book called The Sexual Paradox on the different career trajectories of boys and girls when they become men and women. My brother Rob, my sister's name is Susan, my brother Rob is a policy analyst for the Canadian government. He lives in Ottawa, and he works with the Privy Council, the advisory body to the Canadian government. My parents are still alive. My father, Harry, who just turned 80, is retired, but he worked as a lawyer and as in real estate and in sales in various combinations in various times in his life. My mother was a high school guidance counselor, and they called her Pink the Shrink, and then became the vice principal of the high school, also retired. They did. My mother, like many women of her generation, did not have a career, early on, got her bachelor's degree and immediately contributed to the baby boom in the 1950s, and then got, understandably, restless, and her great talents were not being put to use, and explored her options, and in the 1970s went back, got a master's degree, and then a job as a guidance counselor. But was always intellectually voracious, read, was fantastically informed, much engaged in not just current events, but abstract intellectual ideas, philosophy, science. Probably, if she'd been born in another generation, she would also have been a writer or a scholar. But as it is, she was a very much beloved vice principal and guidance counselor. In fact, all over the world I give talks, and people come up to me and they were students of Pink the Shrink, later Pink the vice principal. My father got a law degree, didn't practice at first, but then decided, after a successful career in running apartments and motels, and decided to reopen a law practice in his, I think, when he turned 50. And then had many years of practicing law before he retired. I am married to yet another writer, Rebecca Goldstein, who is a novelist and a philosopher who's written 6 books of fiction and 2 nonfiction books, one of them on a biography of Baruch Spinoza, the great philosopher, another of Kurt Gödel, the brilliant mathematician. And I have 2 stepdaughters. Yael, yet another writer, who's a novelist, who's Yael Goldstein-Love, whose book The Passion of Tasha Darsky just came out in paperback, and Danielle, who is a poet. Verbal skill probably does have a partly heritable basis, but that would not be enough to predict that a writer would necessarily have a child who's a writer or inclined towards writing. But yeah, I think a facility with language does have heritable basis. Not as much in language. I've enjoyed photography since I was a child, but first really became serious in it about 14 years ago. There's more of a connection in my interest in visual cognition, in how do we perceive depth and color and shape and form? What is a change in perspective due to our experience in a scene? And in fact, my PhD thesis was not on language, but on imagery for three-dimensional scenes. Photography also has some connection to human evolution, because there are some scenes that we find more attractive than others. I remember as a child getting my first book on how-to guide on photography. It was published by Kodak, and I was intrigued by something that they mentioned in this book. They said that in Kodak labs, which at the time, way before digital, people would send their negatives to Kodak and their prints would come back in the mail. And they said that of the shots that they process, most of them fell into a small number of categories. I think they said that photographs with bodies of water were more than half of the snapshots they got. There were also babies and family members, animals, and scenes of mountains, trees, flowers, sunsets. Now that says something, given that there isn't anything, you can't eat a sunset, you can't eat a flower. Why should these be visually fascinating to us? And I think it ties in part to the kind of ecosystem that humans are adapted to, namely with bodies of water, with greenery, with trees, with fruit, with flowers. If you're an ancestral human and you're wandering the landscape and you have a choice of places to live, if you live in that one, that augurs best for your health and well-being, and I think that's reflected in our visual tastes. But that's kind of intellectualizing a hobby, maybe a bit too much. Violence obviously is a complex phenomenon. There isn't one cause of violence. People are violent for a number of reasons. One of them is just sheer predatory violence. You want something that the other guy has, you steal it from him, you get rid of him if he resists, or she, if in the case of sexual violence. There's also moralistic violence. An awful lot of violence people do because they think it's morally justified to punish someone for something. Genocides are often instigated as some kind of payback or revenge for some perfidy you think that another group has visited on your group. There's also just sheer macho, boastful violence to establish that you're formidable enough that other people don't want to mess with you. You prove it by showing that you can get away with violence. So just in this last 60 seconds, I've given 3 different causes of violence, and there are probably others. Well, part of it is in both The Blank Slate and How the Mind Works, I talked about human violence as something that grows out of human nature, in particular out of male nature. Men, the biggest risk factor for violence is being male by a long shot. Violence is largely a guy thing. It's often concentrated in a certain span of the lifetime, namely in the teens and 20s. It tends to flourish in male-only environments, like frontier regions, tends to flourish in the absence of third-party enforcers, like in zones of anarchy, in inner-city drug rings, in mountainous regions beyond the reach of the law. For all that, for all of the ways in which violence grows out of human nature, we also see through history that it has gone down. Most people are astonished to hear this claim, that by many measures we're living in more peaceable times now than in all of human history. Rates of homicide in all Western countries have plummeted from what they were a few hundred years ago. War between major nations might be a thing of the past, between developed major powers. We don't have as many forms of gruesome mutilation and torture and capital punishment as you would find in England a few hundred years ago, and many other ways in which we've become nicer. This hasn't been a biological change, or at least most of it couldn't have been, because it's just too recent. A lot of it is just in the last 60 years. So what allows us to live more peaceably, even though I think we still have some of these violent inclinations, which we see in our taste in entertainment. Entertainment is as bloody as ever, but we do less of it in real life. It's that paradox that I want to explore in the next book, which I call The Better Angels of Our Nature. So I'm going to be kind of sitting high on the food chain, relying on statistics gathered by others on a realm of domains of violence, everything from frequency of war over time and casualties per war, to homicide statistics, legal changes like how many countries had legalized slavery at different points in history. So I'm going to try to make sense of that from a psychologist's vantage point, namely, why did people wake up one morning and say, oh, we shouldn't burn heretics to death, or keeping slaves isn't such a great idea? Of course, they didn't wake up one morning, but nonetheless, there's a change, sometimes a rapid change, where slavery was just a labor-saving device to slavery was a moral abomination. War used to be something that was good for you. It was masculinizing. It improved the vigor of the nation. Now, even people who are in favor of military engagements have to say that it's to eliminate tyranny or some immediate threat. The idea that war is a good thing has vanished from our culture. So how did all these changes take place? That's what I'm currently thinking about. Well, it's as someone who likes cracking puzzles, this is a great puzzle of language. Why are certain words, which everyone has heard a zillion times, why do they give offense? Why are they considered immoral? Why do we use them in all these strange ways? Why do so many obscene expressions violate the laws of syntax and semantics? There are lots of linguistic puzzles that are raised by swearing, and I knew that they weren't just linguistics, but they had to tap into some deep feature of human emotion. And so it was a great topic, and not a whole lot of people have studied it, even though everyone has strong opinions about it. Well, anyone who speaks more than one language knows that the literal content of swear words varies from language to language. So where I grew up in Quebec, in Québécois French, when you want to shout out something rude, you say maudit tabarnak, accursed tabernacle. It kind of loses something in translation. And there are languages in which if you were to translate the F word, it would be like saying copulate you. It doesn't make any sense. But there are common denominators for all that variation. Generally, taboo words fall into a small number of categories having to do with strong negative emotion. You've got words connecting to supernatural powers, like the tabernacle and colles, chalice, another Québécois swear word. We have God, damn, hell, Jesus Christ. There are words surrounding sexuality, sexual organs, sexual activities, sexual perversions. Words for excretion, the substances and the body parts. Words for death and disease. Now, we don't have any in English that are actually literally taboo, but in Yiddish you can shout out choleria, cholera. In Dutch, one of the strongest curses is get cancer. And even in English, we have a little bit of taboo around cancer. It's not a dirty word, but often in obituaries, it will say so-and-so passed away from a long illness. You avoid the word die, you avoid the word cancer, almost as if they're almost dirty words. And then there are also taboo words for people and classes of people that your culture doesn't like. For cripples, enemies, infidels, despised minority groups, such as the most taboo word in American English today, which is not the F word nor the S word, but the N word. And you can get away with saying all kinds of things, but if you were to use the word nigger, and not as a linguistic example as I just did, but you called someone that, then you could lose your job. Michael Richards, the comedian who played Kramer, his career is almost over because he used the word with some patrons at a comedy club. And when people ask me, have we lost all inhibition against swearing? Because indeed, a lot of words you hear in polite company now that you would only have heard in the locker room 50 years ago. But there are also lines that we still don't cross. We don't care so much about religion, and so saying goddamn is not a big deal. Even sexuality with the sexual revolution is not as taboo as it used to be. On the other hand, race is very, very touchy. So Michael Richards got into trouble. Don Imus got into trouble with his comment about nappy-headed hoes. Both seen as racist and misogynist, and so gender is another hot button, another third rail, and homophobia. Ann Coulter, who had a reputation for being outrageous to begin with, much beloved by her conservative constituency, but when she called John Edwards a faggot, she crossed a line and she got into trouble. So we still have our taboos, but the sensitivities change with history. It's almost more like a little more closer to crap. That is, it's not polite, but it's not taboo. It's not something that you can rule out. And you see this across many languages, that the same concept, sometimes even the same word. In French, there's the word con, C-O-N, which not only is, and it means kind of stupid or idiot. Not only is it much more polite than the English equivalent, cunt, but many French speakers are not even aware that that's the origin. And that's what happens with a lot of dirty words. They can become clean as people forget what they originally referred to. And we've, in the last couple of decades, witnessed that happening with the word sucks, where, in fact, my sister Susan told me a story years ago when her daughter was growing up, and she came home from school and she said, oh, Jim really sucked today. And my sister was horrified that an 8-year-old girl was using this, what in her ears was a slang term for fellatio, which is the origin of sucks. But it has become so widespread for just meaning to be bad that people have especially the younger generations, have lost the original image. Oh, absolutely. And there are many examples of diplomatic brouhahas or worse when a leader's words are translated with a slightly different meaning. An example, Khrushchev infamously said, I think it was at the United Nations, to the United States, we will bury you. Now, that seemed to mean we will annihilate you, although probably in the original Russian it meant something more like we will outlive you. That is, we will live long enough to bury you, not that we will kill you and inter you. There's some controversy over what Ahmadinejad meant when he said, well, Israel should be wiped off the map, whether that meant outright genocide or, as in Khrushchev's case, meant something like history will show how viable it is as a society. Not to defend Ahmadinejad by any means, but certainly it would be very wise for us to know exactly what a foreign leader means, and that requires much more attention, I think, to skilled translators of other languages, especially sensitive to the nuance that the words have in the original language. Well, someone who's very astute in both languages can do that, and in fact, it has been a fear of Palestinian negotiating positions that often they're translated in very conciliatory language, but in the original Arabic and in broadcasts directed at Palestinian audiences, they're much more bellicose. And so that is something we have to be quite mindful of. I suspect that the very small grain of truth in that is that I doubt we'll ever be in a society where we can eliminate all armies, all police forces. I doubt that unilateral, total pacifism could be viable, because someone can always pop up who is better armed and run you over, and history has many examples of that. On the other hand, I don't think that it means that we will perpetually have, in particular, nuclear weapons. And in fact, I suspect that I'll probably be dead, but I would not be surprised if the world eliminates nuclear weapons before using them. Even though probably zero force is not viable, that doesn't say that we have to be armed to the teeth, especially not with weapons that are as mad as nuclear weapons. And again, referring to the book that I'm currently working on, you do see reductions in weaponry and war-making ability. We've seen them in Europe since the Second World War. We've seen them, in fact, all countries. Military budget as a proportion of GDP has gone down pretty steadily for many decades. So a belief in human nature, including some of the uglier parts of human nature, which I definitely hold, is not incompatible with a desire for greater peace and arms reduction, even if it's never to zero. But I tend to think if I were younger, I would put money on nuclear weapons being eliminated in 50 years. I think it's not crazy. And many foreign policy hawks are actually believe that this will happen, or at least think that it's a viable option that we ought to pursue, partly because they're not usable realistically. There's a taboo against using nuclear weapons, even small nuclear weapons that are less destructive than many conventional weapons nations have stayed away from, at least so far. And as a result, they're militarily just about useless. And with the fear of nuclear proliferation of more and more countries trying to become big boys, entering the big leagues by emulating countries like us, it may happen that, we ratchet it down in order to remove the temptation to achieve national prestige for other nations by emulating the nuclear capability. So I don't think it's a fantasy. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And I think that that's compatible with the idea that human nature will continue to have dangerous elements. I think there still is a great stigma against a biologically oriented conception of human nature in many of the humanities. In a lot of literary criticism, in a lot of political science, in education. So the state of academia that the email I was writing about is certainly certainly true. On the other hand, I don't think we have to wait another generation from now, because I see it starting to change, especially in a younger generation that hasn't grown up with the same good versus evil ideology that was true in the 1970s. And I see tremendous interest in all of these fields in renewed attention to human nature. I never faced anything like kind of illiberal or nasty. I mean, I got, vicious reviews and so on, but that's, you write a book, you have to expect those. But in terms of what greeted, say, E.O. Wilson a generation before me, having a bucket of ice water dumped on his head at a conference. Some people have gotten death threats, protesters, chanting mobs, disrupting lectures. I've never gotten anything like that, which I think is a sign that the climate is changing. 21 years. This is my 6th year. I taught at Harvard for a year, then Stanford for a year, before settling at MIT for 21 years, and then going back to Harvard 5 years ago. It very much overlaps with my philosophy of writing, and many of the examples that I use and many of the organizational outlines and plans that I use go back and forth between my teaching and my writing. It's a similar audience. It's smart, intellectually curious people, but people who just don't know the jargon and the methods of a particular field, but are voluntarily interested in learning. I feel that material has to be organized in a framework. It can't just be a random dumping of facts on the lap of an audience. So you have to do that I think in writing, you have to do that in teaching. It's got to be engaging, but I do ask of the audiences of my book and of my students that they do have to think hard. My part of the bargain is I don't hide from them information that they need to figure something out. Their part of the bargain is to think through the tough ideas. And of course, there are also differences. I have, they're exams for my students, not for my readers. I have a textbook in addition to my popular book for my students that shows the original data, the graphs, the details of the studies, so they're not just getting a digest of the conclusions, but they actually see how the original studies were done. You would see in the lectures not a lot of, it depends. In my big lecture classes, not in the lecture hall so much, but in the discussion sections. So I always have discussion sections of 15 students where there is debate. In my seminars, more like a dozen people instead of 300 people, then lots, yeah. I have been influenced by Wittgenstein in the following specific way. Namely, Wittgenstein pointed out that a lot of human concepts don't have crisp definitions that characterize them perfectly. His famous example was a game. What do all games have in common? Or what's the definition of game? Well, it can't be winners and losers, because you've got solitaire, you've got a kid throwing a ball against a wall. It can't be physical activity because you've got chess. And no matter what you try to put into the definition, you can find counterexamples. So he suggested that human concepts are family resemblance categories. That is, the different games or the different tools, the different vegetables, each subset shares different properties, the way pairs of members of a family might share hair color or nose or eye color, without everyone having one thing in common or some number of things in common. So I think that was a great insight about human conceptual categories, which I've written about a number of times. On the other hand, I think Wittgenstein was, in other ways, not so sympathetic, or I'm not so sympathetic to his approach. There was something behavioristic about Wittgenstein, in the sense that he did not take seriously mental representations as contents of the mind. I think he would have thought it a mistake to even talk about the kind of things that I like to study, like mental images, like rules of language, like mental representations of the meaning of a sentence. I think Wittgenstein would have said that those were all confusions, but I take them quite seriously as a non-behaviorist. Well, how it relates to the First Amendment per se might better be left to a legal scholar. I don't think that the First Amendment would either protect or outlaw the use of languages other than English, but I'm not a constitutional scholar. I think there has to be some kind of eclecticism. That is, I don't think the government should ever make use of language, a particular language, illegal. Maybe that falls under the First Amendment, I don't know. I think it should provide opportunities for everyone to master English, including children in school. I think a lot of so-called bilingual education programs in the United States have been unsuccessful because they keep children in Spanish-only classes for far too long. I think education should take advantage of the fact that children are especially good at mastering language, to make sure that they're exposed to English early on. But I don't think that there should be any kind of coercion, especially outside school, that would outlaw the use of language. I think whether government documents should be provided in another language should be a matter of pragmatism and common sense. If it's just a fact that there are a lot of people who aren't going to understand traffic laws in English and you're testing them for a driver's license, it's probably a better idea to have people who know the laws when licensing them than to use that as your battleground for complete English mastery. So I would prefer not to be ideological about it and treat it on a common sense basis. Probably not dramatically differently. It's certainly not true, as many people used to believe, and probably some people still believe, that being bilingual hurts you cognitively. That there used to be these myths that children would get confused, they'd be liable to learning disabilities, they would associate one language with masculine things and another one with feminine things if they learn one from ma and one from pa, all of which have turned out to be myths. What children do get in mastering two languages is probably a better appreciation of language as an object itself. That is, they know that there are these things called languages. In fact, some studies that I did many years ago showed that bilingual children are better able than monolingual children to think about language. That is, if you ask them, why do we call a cup a cup? A monolingual child will say, well, because that's where you put your coffee and it's got a handle. And a bilingual child will say, well, if you called it something else, no one would know what you're talking about. And the second answer, of course, is the correct answer. Words are arbitrary labels shared in a community. And when you know that you have to call it a cup with one group of people and something else with another group of people, you're forced to think about what language is and how it works. So that's a definite advantage of bilingualism. But I don't think it makes bilinguals think differently across the board. Oh, well, it has to start with someone. Mm-hmm. Some wordsmith somewhere has to have the light bulb that allows him or her to put a sound together with a concept that doesn't yet have a label. And it's a bit mysterious how it happens. Most of us are bad at conjuring nonsense syllables out of the air, like blick or glorg. So first, a sound has to come to mind. Often this will be encouraged by sound symbolism. There's certain sounds that feel like they go with certain concepts. Bling, grungy, scuzzy, gonzo. They probably had the odds in their favor for being connected to what we now use them for. Usually there has to be some kind of lexical gap, that is a concept that's worth talking about, that for which the language doesn't yet supply a word. And then there's this mysterious process of epidemiology, of word contagion. You use it, someone else has to remember it and use it with someone else, who has to remember it and use it with someone else, until it becomes epidemic, and then it becomes a new word in the language. So all three of those processes are somewhat mysterious, and it's almost impossible to predict what words will catch on and what concepts will remain nameless. Print must greatly expand the number of words that can be kept in circulation at any one time, because you don't have to rely on your memory or your small neighborhood of contacts. There is a discussion in the book on why metaphors are so common in science, the realm of discourse in which we feel we have the surest route to truth. And there's a big difference between the use of metaphor in poetry and everyday conversation on the one hand, and science on the other, which is in science you always have to be mindful of which aspects of the metaphor or analogy you take seriously, and which are just ornamentation or flesh on the skeleton, that just, to use two more metaphors, that get in the way of understanding. And often, when a metaphor is introduced in science, there will be some misunderstandings and some debate and subsequent clarification as to what aspects of the metaphor ought to be taken seriously. I'll give two examples. The selfish gene, the book that I alluded to in the intermission. No one should believe or can believe that DNA actually has motives or consciousness or intentions in the same way that a human brain has intentions and consciousness. Nonetheless, the metaphor is useful in the sense that the genes will be selected for effects that replicate copies of that gene. So that's a kernel of meaning shared by selfishness as we apply it to people, and selfishness as Richard Dawkins applied it to genes. And as long as you focus on that common core of meaning and don't get distracted by things like conscious intentions, it can continue to be useful. Another one is the brain as a computer, which was popular in the 1960s in my own field, in cognitive psychology, where again there can be a lot of misleading aspects to that if you took it too seriously. The idea that the brain follows discrete rules, the way a computer follows steps in a program. The idea that the brain does things one at a time in serial order as opposed to massively parallel fashion. Those could certainly be misleading. On the other hand, there probably is, in fact, I would argue that, in fact, there is a common thread that applies both to the explanation of what makes brains intelligent and the explanation of what makes computers intelligent, and that would be some kind of information processing. So, in my current concerns, one auxiliary metaphor that I used in the stuff of thought was that language is not just a window into human nature, but a fistula, that is a gaping hole in a tissue. And that's because one of the reasons that we're often so circumspect about using language, we don't just blurt out what we mean, but we often veil our intentions in innuendo and euphemism and doublespeak, is because using language directly can reveal too much about ourselves, and we often have to take self-protective measures to prevent infection, as one is vulnerable to if one has a fistula, an open wound. And so language has not just the positive connotations of revealing the workings of the mind, but the possible dangerous connotations of allowing us to be infected by information that we get. Yes, there's a whole range of expressions that we use without thinking too much about what they literally mean, such as "you're welcome." I don't even know if, even prior to this conversation, I ever thought about what it means to say "you're welcome." I guess it means it's no imposition, feel free to ask for something similar again in the future. No problem, of course, means I am not putting myself, or I don't mind the fact that I have been putting myself out to accede to your request because I like you so much that what ordinarily would be a problem is not one in this case if I can help you. And now we don't really think through the literal content. They become formulas that you have to learn when you learn a native language. One of the first things that you learn when you go to some other country, even if you know nothing else about Italian, you learn how to say please, thank you, excuse me. Yeah, excuse me is a little odd too when you think about it, especially when you go up to a stranger and you say, excuse me, do you know the time? You're asking for forgiveness before you even,
Right.
as if the mere asking of the question is some kind of injury for which you need forgiveness. Now, we don't think about these, but we absolutely depend on them in order to be conversational speakers. And that's one category of politeness. The other category that I'm more interested in my own research is when we compose the request for the occasion. Sometimes it's called off-record indirect speech as opposed to on-record. On-record indirect speech is please, thank you, you're welcome, can you pass the salt, do you know the time? Each of which, when you think about it, is a little odd in terms of its literal content, but it's a move in a game that we all know what to make. An off-record indirect speech act would be something like, gee, I have a really nice view from my balcony. Would you like to come up for coffee at the end of a date? Which can be interpreted as a sexual come on. There, it's not a formula that you memorize, but both the speaker and the hearer have to do a little minuet figuring out what's really going on. And those are two different kinds of politeness. There's a third kind where you use false terms of affiliation or even kinship. Hey, brother, or buddy, or use of in-group slang, you lend me a couple of bucks, where you impose a kind of spurious friendship or camaraderie in approaching someone. Those are just three of the many kinds of politeness that linguists have tried to analyze. These are examples of how people don't intuitively conform to the linguist's idea that a name is an arbitrary label. That's one of the first things you learn in linguistics, that a sound can be anything as long as it's consistently used to refer to its referent. But people don't buy it intuitively. Swearing is an example where we think that the moral order is threatened by merely uttering a word, even though using a polite synonym refers to the same thing, but we feel that there's some huge moral difference between them. Prayer is another example of what's sometimes called word magic. That is, thinking that words are actually lawfully connected to the thing they stand for. It's almost as if it's one of your essential traits, as opposed to a label that your mom just gave you when you were born. And in the case of Barack Obama, the fact that his middle name is Hussein, widespread throughout not just the Arab world, but in Africa, where his father came from, and I believe it was the name of his paternal grandfather. People, no matter how many times they're told, can't shake off this intuition that Obama is a Muslim because he has a name that's traditionally associated with many Muslims. And I think even people who would not credit it if they thought it through allow themselves to be infected by that feeling, well, maybe deep down he is sympathetic to the Arab world, despite his repeated, heartfelt, sincere declarations of solidarity with Israel. He might favor the Arabs because of that middle name. Now, it makes no sense. A name is just, what's in a name, as Shakespeare said. But I think it's part of that psychological phenomenon of word magic, that we think that the person's essence is revealed through his name. Again, this is one of those questions that I'm kind of, in a sense, it's above my pay grade in that I never received clinical training or have clinical expertise. Certainly, it very much depends on the age of the person and on the idiosyncrasies of their particular brain injury, how much and what kind of therapy can be effective. In some cases, it can be extremely effective, and probably you and the clinical neurologists and neuropsychologists that you work with are aware of programs of therapy and rehabilitation that can make the most of what language skills these patients still have. Yes. I don't. Syndromes like depression probably are heterogeneous across people. I think in all cases there's a common core that depression is an adaptive response to certain kinds of loss, situations that force you to stop what you've been doing, to rethink your situation, perhaps to see the world more accurately. Most of us are the victims or the beneficiaries of positive illusions. We actually overestimate how competent we are, how knowledgeable, how effective, what our chances in life are. It probably helps us to keep going. And in many ways, depressed people have a more accurate assessment of of life's odds than non-depressed people. And I think that's the reason why we're subject to depression in the first place. There are cases in which we have to slow down, stop doing what we've been doing. You know, as they say about holes, the first law of the hole is if you're in one, stop digging. On the other hand, there are also cases in which depression can take on a life of its own, when it's longer lasting than any possible adaptive readjustment of your life. Because of heritable differences, some people are just innately more susceptible to depression than others. Because of abnormalities in brain chemistry that can prolong a depression beyond any point of usefulness. And for those things, I'm not at all squeamish about the proper use of antidepressants. And the attitude that you sometimes hear, well, depressed people, they just need a swift kick in the rear end. They're just being lazy. Can be deeply ignorant and cruel, because to the person who's in the depressed state, it's just objectively correct that life is hopeless. And it's not a matter of just getting a swift kick, but really jump-starting yourself into the point of view where something that you do can make a difference, which is exactly what you aren't thinking in the throes of a deep depression. So I think an understanding just that the brain is a biochemical system, and intelligently applied changes to that chemistry, I think, can be enormously humane. There does seem to be a difference in depression and anxiety. That anxiety seems to involve images. You imagine yourself in some threatening situation, and vividly and concretely live through what it would be like to be in this threatening or challenging scenario. Depression seems to be a bit more verbal. People who are depressed will say things to themselves like, life is hopeless, there's no reason to go on, nothing makes any difference, life has nothing that makes it worth living. And I don't know why there is this difference, but depression seems to be a bit more verbal, anxiety a little bit more imagistic. Well, Jung, in talking about universal archetypes, themes and symbols that people in many cultures seem to find compelling, I think was talking about certain features of human nature. There's certain themes that people everywhere will find fascinating, such as a righteous hero conquering evil, perhaps winning the love of a worthy woman, fights against animals, conflicts within a family. And collective unconscious may be a fancy way of talking about themes that we all appreciate because of our shared nature. Jung's particular mechanism of collective racial memory, that somehow something happens to a tribe and it gets internalized, is very unlikely. And in answer to the question of telepathy, out-of-body experiences, and so on, I believe the evidence suggests that they don't exist. So that makes it easy to look for an explanation, namely, there's nothing to explain, and so you don't need anything fancy. I think all of the attempts to get around coincidence, false memory, outright charlatans, such as stage magicians who use magic tricks to make you think that they're doing telepathy, all of those have been exposed, and there's no reason right now to believe that there is anything that can't be accounted for by the laws of physics and brain physiology. Well, I think the answer might be different for different kinds of concepts, and some of this pertains to debates in philosophy where I can't claim any expertise. But say numbers, I think there are many mathematicians who would say that they have a kind of reality. It's not that they're out there in some part of the universe, but that they exist independent of human knowers, such that all intelligent agents would have to discover their properties in much the same ways. That's a position in the philosophy of mathematics that I find congenial. For things like Democrats and Republicans, or a rook in chess, or a goalie in hockey, whether they have some reality independent of human knowers is much more obscure, and I don't know if I have a strong opinion on that. Certainly when you enter into some kind of games rule system, certain things necessarily follow, so there's a sense in which they have reality when they're well specified. But more than that would be probably more metaphysical than I can credibly pronounce on. Yes, your first question was about the Tower of Babel? Yeah. Well, the Tower of Babel is a wonderful metaphor for the dispersion of languages and why we have so many languages now. Of course, I don't believe the story of the Tower of Babel. I think that's clearly fiction. But it nonetheless is true that many language families, say all the Indo-European languages, from Sanskrit and Hindi through Farsi, it's spoken in Iran, through the Romance languages, the Slavic languages, the Germanic languages, including English, all have similarities that suggest that they historically descended from a single group of speakers, some mysterious people sometimes called the Proto-Indo-Europeans. So the grain of truth in the Tower of Babel story is that you can get diverse languages as descendants by a process quite similar to biological evolution from an ancestral population. But I don't believe that there's any deliberate design in it that God tried to confuse people so that they wouldn't approach heaven or all of that stuff. In terms of the names of God, I think that's a beautiful example of word magic. And you're right to connect it to the phenomenon that people have this gut feeling that Obama must be Muslim because of his name, Hussein. We read far too much into names. We think they have a power that the actual thing that the name stands for has. Now, when it comes to God, the most powerful thing that we can conceive of, then the phenomenon of word magic comes in spades, and therefore the name of God is a very, very touchy matter. In Judaism, as you point out, one never pronounces the name of God. In fact, no one knows how to pronounce it. Yahweh is a reconstruction of the most likely pronunciation, but by tradition it could only be uttered by the high priests in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant on the holiest day of the year. It's spelled the four letters, the tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, which can then be pronounced Jehovah, an incorrect pronunciation, but it's consistent with the letters. And you don't go there if you're an observant Jew. In fact, you don't even, nor do you use the word El, or casually, which is cognate with Allah, for God himself. You mentioned the Lord as a euphemism. There's also Hashem in Hebrew, the name, as a way of referring to God. Because the intuition is, and it's a primitive intuition, but one that people can't get away from, that as soon as you mention the name, it's as if his eyes are on you. He's saying, yes, you called me, and you don't necessarily want God looking at you too carefully every time you mention the name. And so by discussing it obliquely, you hope to get a little bit of a breathing space. And I think it's a very similar phenomenon, and this is almost blasphemous to say it, to why we use euphemisms like the N-word, the S-word, the F-word, like a long illness instead of cancer, or passed away instead of died, that there's some emotional stab that we get when using the word for a fraught concept that we avoid by reaching for a euphemism instead. I think that most of the claims that you probably heard for the role of melanin are exaggerated. They've gone into quite exotic and kooky theories of differences between the behavior and emotions of blacks versus whites. I think melanin can involve some of the same biochemical pathways as chemicals that are involved in the brain, but that I'm not sure what you're referring to, but chances are it's some pseudoscience. There's nothing on the horizon that would be so specific as to improve language abilities. It's not out of the question that there could be drugs that focus attention better than our current drugs, like the coffee in this cup, without the jittery side effects. Mm-hmm. It's not inconceivable that there will be drugs that will enhance memory, But I don't think that any of the science fiction scenarios of drugs that would give you superhuman powers are things that we'll see in our lifetime. The brain's just too complicated. Oh, well, I think some of the studies on development of the brain in utero and the pathways by which neurons are guided to their destinations, hook up with other neurons is exciting. I think the application of functional neuroimaging, like fMRI, to aspects of brain function that were previously just too hard to look at in terms of the brain, like empathy, social cognition, morality, religion, is exciting. I think the study of using new genomic techniques of the genetic basis of thought and emotion and personality are of interest. And I think the connections to evolution, using evolutionary theory to ask the why question, the what for question about features of human psychology is tremendously exciting. I think they'll get better. I don't think they'll be cures in the same sense that we have, a vaccine that's done away with smallpox or polio. I think that they're too heterogeneous, too complicated, but I do think they'll get better. Yes, well, we often borrow emotion words from one language to another. Schadenfreude being an example, pleasure in another's misfortunes. Chutzpah from Hebrew, probably originally from Slavic language. Angst, also from German. And they don't always have the same meaning as they had in the original language. Chutzpah being an example, where in Yinglish, or borrowed use of Yiddish words in English, it often refers to something good, to spunk, or gall, or ambition, or gumption. Whereas in Hebrew, it refers to aggressiveness, and it's a bad thing. If you accuse someone of showing chutzpah, it means they're arrogantly demanding something that they have no right to, as opposed to just being impressively self-assertive. Schadenfreude, I'm told, has a slightly different meaning in German than its use in English. And this often happens in any kind of translation, that the word changes its meaning. I think there's so many more emotions than there are words for emotion that we're always tempted to borrow words from other languages. Emotions are continuous or analog, and words put them into discrete pigeonholes, which means there'll always be an emotional richness that we feel we have trouble expressing. And so if we learn of a word from another language that does a slightly better job than the current inventory in English, we're apt to borrow it. And in doing so, like any words, there can be some loss in translation. In terms of Antonio Damasio has emphasized the importance of the emotions in rationality. That there are some cases in which fear, for example, can be an important motivator in avoiding dangerous options. He's shown that people with damage to a certain parts of the brain involving the connections between the emotional circuitry and the higher thought processes can sometimes leave a person worse off. They make foolish choices and risky decisions because they don't get that wave of sweat or butterflies in the stomach that ordinarily inhibit us from doing stupid things. So it isn't always true that emotions are a bad thing. No, it isn't true. And in French, just to take one example, you have the word faire, which can mean either to make or to do, whereas in English we have two different words for them. Yeah. Inevitably, when you compare languages, you find areas in which one language makes a lot of distinctions and the other one lumps it together in one word, but often cases where the reverse is true. And that in general, when any language has a written form and has accumulated vocabulary and idioms, it'll be very hard to say that one language is more expressive than another. Yes, it is a marvelous book by Hofstadter. On the perils and complexities and richness and ambiguities of translation. I think that Jane certainly went too far in implying that consciousness itself is a recent invention of literate cultures. That's taken literally, that can't be true. I mean, your dog or your cat is not a robot. It feels pain, it feels hunger. Babies have obviously have consciousness before they've acquired any language or have been socialized, although he probably meant consciousness in a much narrower sense than the one that a neuroscientist would use. I think there's a danger in that James fell into, and that was also one of my disagreements with George Lakoff, of making too much of the metaphorical roots of words. I think they are significant in highlighting the similarities that a person is apt to see between something abstract and something concrete. But it doesn't mean that every time someone uses a metaphor, they're actually thinking through to the original image that inspired the metaphor. And so you can't, without having the flesh and blood speaker in front of you to test, to interrogate, to experiment with, just because they use a metaphor doesn't mean that they think metaphorically. And a simple way of showing that is among us to look at things like mixed metaphors, where we can't possibly be thinking through the image. Otherwise, we wouldn't say things like the ship of state is sailing up a one-way street, which a politician once said, or my favorite example that I cite in the book is the defender of Richard Nixon, who said the American press has literally emasculated Nixon, where the use of literal and the metaphor of emasculation, meaning remove the power and dignity from, obviously didn't register at that speaker at that moment. And so if you look back at ancient texts and you look at the metaphors they use, you don't know if it simply occurred to the coiner of the idiom as an effective way of getting that concept across at a stage at which the language didn't have any other way of expressing it, or if they really were so concrete that that image came to mind when they used the metaphor. That would be my principal caveat. Everything you always wanted to know about language, except what I wrote about in my other two books on language.
Right.
So it's a general introduction to how language works, how it's acquired, how it changes. Everything else about the mind, everything from how we see to how we think, to our emotions, to our social relationships, to humor, art, and philosophy. Seeing the world in a grain of sand, how to understand language through one phenomenon approached through many angles. The concept of human nature and why it is so politically, morally, and emotionally fraught. Language is a window into human nature, what our words reveal about how we think, how we feel, and how we relate to each other socially. For language itself, I'd say start with the language instinct. For human nature, I'd say start with how the mind works. It'll probably be published in 2011. In 11. How do you say that? 2011. That violence has been in decline for millennia and centuries and decades, and it sure would be good to know why. Thanks so much for having me.